This is the story of how a popular World War II aviation legend conceals a far more interesting historical truth. The claim that Japanese pilots radioed back in shock, reporting that American fighters were climbing like zeros during their first encounter with the F6F Hellcat, has been repeated in aviation books, documentaries, and online forums for decades. One problem, though, it never happened. The quote lacks any verifiable source in military archives, pilot memoirs, or radio intercept records, and the technical reality directly contradicts it. Official United States Navy trials proved the Japanese Zero actually outclimbed the Hellcat below 14,000 feet, which means if Japanese pilots had radioed this observation, they would have been describing a performance characteristic that actually favored their own aircraft. Neither the quote nor the premise behind it holds up under scrutiny. Aviation legends like this one persist because they capture an emotional truth, even while getting the facts wrong. Japanese pilots who had dominated American fighters for nearly 2 years really were shocked when they encountered the F6F Hellcat in the skies over the Pacific in late 1943. But what stunned them wasn't climb rate. What they suddenly realized was that they no longer held air superiority in almost any category that mattered in combat. We're going to examine what actually happened during the F6F Hellcat's first combat encounters, who was flying these missions, and why the real story is more compelling than the myth. You'll see verified dates, documented pilots, official performance data, and the catastrophic collapse of Japanese naval aviation that made the Hellcat's dominance possible. And by the end, you'll understand why historians need to be skeptical of dramatic quotes that sound too good to be true, and why the verified facts of the Pacific Air War are fascinating enough without embellishment. The Hellcat's combat debut. Marcus Island, August 31st, 1943. August 31st, 1943, marked the Grumman F6F Hellcat's entry into combat during a raid against Marcus Island. Task Force 15, commanded by Rear Admiral Charles A. Pownall, whom his men called Baldy Pownall, launched strikes from 3 American aircraft carriers as part of a broader series designed to probe Japanese defenses in the Central Pacific before the major offensives that would follow. USS Yorktown, designated CV-10, USS Essex, CV-9, and USS Independence, CVL-22, all carried the new fighter into battle for the first time. VF-5 from Yorktown under Commander Charles Crommelin, VF-9 from Essex under Lieutenant Commander Phil Torrey, and VF-6 from Independence became the first squadrons to fly F6F Hellcats in combat. VF-6 had a special distinction because Lieutenant Commander Edward H. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient for his extraordinary defense of USS Lexington back in February 1942, commanded the II Squadron. O'Hare, universally known as Butch, had personally visited the Grumman factory in April 1942 and provided combat intelligence that directly influenced the Hellcat's development. And now he was leading one of the first squadrons to take the new fighter into battle. Marcus Island itself was a small Japanese-held location used as a staging base, and the operation gave American commanders their first opportunity to evaluate the F6F under actual combat conditions, test its carrier operations in a war zone, and begin building pilot confidence in the new aircraft. The raid was relatively modest in scale, but served its purpose as a shakedown mission. September 1st, 1943, brought the first confirmed aerial victory by an F6F Hellcat when Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loesch of VF-6 shot down a Kawanishi H-8K, known to the Allies by the codename Emily. This 4-engine flying boat was a patrol aircraft rather than a fighter, which meant it was a kill and an important first blood for the Hellcat, but it wasn't the dramatic fighter-versus-fighter encounter that would come next. The first Zero kill Wake Island, October 5, 1943. October 5, 1943, during the Wake Island raid, is when the first verified kill of a Japanese Zero by a carrier-based Hellcat occurred. And this is where the story gets interesting, where we find the closest thing to a verified anecdote that might have inspired the climbing like zeros legend. Ensign Robert W. Duncan of VF5 shot down 2 Zeros in a single engagement that day, and one of his victims was reportedly Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda, a Japanese ace credited with 9 victories. Source quality matters here, though, and I need to be transparent about what we actually know. Accounts that appear in various aviation publications claim Sueda initially mistook the F6F Hellcat for the older F4F Wildcat because of their similar Grumman design lineage. The story goes that Sueda attempted his signature tactic, a climbing loop that had successfully caused F4F Wildcats to stall out while pursuing him. But when he pulled up expecting the American fighter to fall away, as Wildcats had done before, Ensign Duncan's more powerful Hellcat followed him through the maneuver. Duncan stayed with him through the climb and shot him down, which makes for a compelling narrative. Here's where historical honesty matters, though. This anecdote appears in aviation enthusiast publications and websites, often citing each other rather than primary military documents. And it does not appear in Barrett Tillman's definitive book, Hellcat, the F6F in World War II, which represents the most thoroughly documented operational history of the aircraft. Historical research demands we treat this story as plausible but unverified, as aviation legend rather than established fact. I'm including it because it's the closest thing to a documented encounter that matches the spirit of the climbing claim. But I'm flagging it as unverified because that's what honest historical research demands. What we can verify absolutely is that Ensign Duncan did shoot down 2 Zeros on October 5, 1943, and that this represented the first confirmed Zero kills by a carrier-based Hellcat pilot. Land-based Hellcats from VF-33 operating from Guadalcanal had achieved their first validated Zero kill slightly earlier on September 9th when Ensign Harry Cantrell downed Warrant Officer Tsukasa Kondo of Air Group 201 over the Shortland Islands. Performance data from official comparative trials makes the climbing like zeros quote technically impossible, and we need to examine these numbers because they explain what really happened in the skies over the Pacific. Naval Air Station Patuxent River conducted tests between an F6F-5 and a captured A6M50, the Model 52 variant. And these tests produced definitive numbers that every historian should know. From sea level up to 9,000 feet, the Zero had a climb rate advantage of about 600 feet per minute over the Hellcat, and 600 feet per minute is substantial. Between 9,000 and 14,000 feet, that advantage diminished, and at 14,000 feet, the two aircraft were roughly equal in climb performance. Only above 14,000 feet did the Hellcat's climb rate begin to exceed the Zero's, and even then, the advantage was only 250 to 500 feet per minute. The specific numbers tell the story. Real-world testing showed the F6F Hellcat's documented climb rate ranged from 2,660 to 3,120 feet per minute at sea level, while Grumman specification sheets claimed 3,650 feet per minute under ideal conditions, but actual flight tests produced lower figures. The A6M20 climbed at approximately 3,100 feet per minute at sea level, which means if a Japanese pilot radioed that American fighters were climbing like zeros, he would have been describing a performance characteristic that actually favored his own aircraft at the altitudes where most Pacific air combat occurred. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine gave the Hellcat its superior high-altitude climb by delivering between 2,000 and 2,200 horsepower. This engine featured a two-stage supercharger that compressed incoming air, compensating for the thinner atmosphere at high altitude, while the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine produced only about 1,100 horsepower and lacked comparable supercharging technology. But here's the thing. Climb rate was not what made the Hellcat dominant. Speed, diving performance, firepower, and survivability were the categories where the F6F fundamentally changed the air war. Maximum speed for the Hellcat ranged from 376 to 391 miles per hour, depending on altitude and aircraft variant, while the Zero's top speed was 331 to 351 miles per hour. That 25 to 40 mile per hour advantage at all altitudes was decisive because it meant the Hellcat pilot could engage when he wanted and break off when he wanted, and the Zero pilot no longer controlled the terms of engagement. Diving attacks became the preferred American tactic because the Hellcat could exceed 480 miles per hour in a dive, while the Zero's airframe had structural limits around 460 miles per hour. American pilots learned to use diving attacks knowing the Zero couldn't follow without risking structural failure, which gave them a way to escape any engagement that went wrong. Roll rate tells another story about combat advantage. The Hellcat had superior roll performance above 235 miles per hour, which was 200 knots, and this mattered enormously for breaking off attacks and evading pursuit. The Zero rolled better at low speeds, which helped in tight-turning dogfights, but the Hellcat pilot, who understood his aircraft's strengths, never got into those turning fights in the first place. Firepower was overwhelming. 6 50 caliber machine guns with 2,400 rounds of ammunition gave the F6F sustained firing capability, while the Zero had 2 20mm cannon with only 120 rounds total, plus 2 7.7mm machine guns. American pilots could fire sustained bursts, but Japanese pilots had to make every cannon shell count because they'd exhaust their ammunition in seconds of continuous fire. Survivability made the difference between going home and going down. The Hellcat featured 212 pounds of cockpit armor, a bullet-resistant windshield, and self-sealing fuel tanks, and the Zero had none of these features, literally none. Japanese design philosophy prioritized performance and range over pilot protection, which made the Zero an exceptional fighter in 1941, when Japanese pilots were highly trained veterans who could avoid getting hit. By 1943, though, when pilot quality had collapsed and they were facing overwhelming numbers of American fighters, that design philosophy became a death sentence. Why the F4F Wildcat required the THAC weave. Understanding why Japanese pilots were genuinely shocked by the Hellcat requires understanding what they'd been fighting before. The F4F Wildcat served as the U.S. Navy's primary carrier fighter from Pearl Harbor through most of 1943, and while it was a tough, reliable aircraft, it was comprehensively outperformed by the Zero in almost every category. Top speed for the Wildcat was around 318 miles per hour, slower than the Zero. Climb rate was worse, turning radius was worse, and range was much worse, which meant American pilots flying Wildcats against Zeros survived through teamwork rather than through aircraft performance. Commander John S. Thack, known as Jimmy Thack, developed a defensive tactic specifically because individual Wildcats couldn't compete with Zeros in one-on-one combat. The Thack weave involved 2 fighters flying side by side, weaving toward each other when attacked, and if a Zero got on the tail of the lead aircraft, the wingman would be positioned to fire on the Zero as it crossed in front of him. They'd reverse and protect each other continuously, creating a defensive web that negated the Zero's performance advantages. The tactic worked, and the Wildcat's kill ratio improved from about 1.5 to 1 in early 1942 to 6.9 to 1 by war's end. That's an impressive improvement, but it was fundamentally a survival tactic rather than a winning strategy. Wildcat pilots had to avoid one-on-one engagements. They had to rely on mutual support. They couldn't pursue escaping Zeros because they lacked the speed. And they couldn't exploit altitude advantages because they lacked the climb rate. Everything changed with the F6F Hellcat. 67 to 83% more engine power than the F4F4 Wildcat, over 2,000 horsepower versus 1,200, meant speed increased by 58 to 73 miles per hour and climb rate improved by roughly 50%. American pilots no longer needed to avoid engagement. They could pursue, they could dictate terms, and they could use their aircraft strengths offensively rather than defensively. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots had enjoyed superiority against every American fighter they encountered. Their tactics worked, their training worked, their aircraft worked, and then suddenly in the fall of 1943, those advantages evaporated. The collapse of Japanese naval aviation. Most aviation enthusiasts miss the most important context when they focus solely on aircraft performance. By the time the F6F Hellcat entered combat in August 1943, Japanese naval aviation was already in catastrophic decline. The elite pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor with an average of 700 flight hours were gone, ground down through 2 years of attrition with no systematic rotation policy to pull combat veterans back for instructor duty. Midway in June 1942 killed approximately 100 experienced carrier pilots in a single day. The loss of 4 fleet carriers gets all the historical attention, but the loss of those pilots was arguably more devastating because you can build a new carrier in 18 months, but you cannot train a new expert pilot in 18 months, especially when you have no systematic rotation policy. Guadalcanal from August 1942 through February 1943 ground down Japanese naval aviation through continuous attrition. Rabaul earned its nickname as the graveyard of fighter pilots among Japanese aviators, and the 600-mile flight to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal exhausted fuel reserves and exposed them to American radar-directed interception both coming and going. By October 1942, roughly 400 of the 750 pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor were dead, more than half the force that had started the war. Pilot training collapsed under this attrition. Average flight hours for new Navy pilots fell from 700 hours in December 1941 to 275 hours by January 1945, and late 1944 graduates were entering combat with as little as 40 hours of total flight time. 40 hours is barely enough to learn basic aircraft handling, let alone combat tactics, let alone the situational awareness needed to survive against experienced opponents. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's legendary aces, recalled that by 1943, hardly a day passed when fire engines and ambulances did not race down the runways to dig one or more pilots out of the plane they had wrecked on a clumsy takeoff or landing. These were the pilots being sent into combat against Americans who entered the fight with a minimum of 500 hours of training, taught by rotating combat veterans using standardized curricula that incorporated lessons learned from every engagement. The F6F Hellcat also had excellent handling characteristics that made it forgiving for relatively inexperienced pilots. Wide landing gear stance reduced the risk of ground loops. Good visibility from the cockpit helped with carrier operations, and no dangerous flight quirks meant fewer accidents. Even average pilots could operate the Hellcat effectively from carrier decks, while the Zero's long nose and narrow gear made it challenging even for experienced pilots to land safely. The myth of the captured Zero. Another persistent myth appears in many Hellcat histories and needs to be corrected. The claim that the F6F was designed based on data from the Akuten Zero recovered intact from Alaska in July 1942. This is demonstrably false, and it's important to correct it because it misunderstands how the Hellcat came to be. June 26, 1942 was when the XF6F1 prototype first flew. The Akuten Zero wasn't recovered until July 10, 1942, 2 weeks later, and it wasn't restored and flight tested until October 1942, months after the Hellcat prototype had already flown. The U.S. Naval Institute's Naval History magazine explicitly debunked this claim in 1989. Yet it continues to appear in popular histories because people want to believe American ingenuity came from reverse engineering a captured enemy aircraft. What the captured Zero DID influence was tactical doctrine rather than aircraft design. Test flights at Naval Air Station Patuxent River revealed specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited in combat. The Zero's ailerons froze at speeds above 200 knots, making it difficult to roll at high speeds, and the aircraft rolled left better than it rolled right due to engine torque effects. The float-type carburetor caused the engine to cut out under negative G-forces, which meant the Zero couldn't push over into a dive smoothly because the engine would momentarily quit. This intelligence led to specific tactical recommendations in the official trials report. Do not dogfight with a 052. Do not try to follow a loop or half-roll with a pull-through. When attacking, use your superior power and high-speed performance to engage at high speed, make one firing pass, and use your superior dive performance to break off if you don't achieve a kill. The F6F's design was actually driven by combat reports from F4F Wildcat pilots, and Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare's visit to the Grumman factory on April 22, 1942, was particularly influential. O'Hare had first-hand combat experience against Zeros and could articulate exactly what American pilots needed, and 4 days after his visit on April 26th, the Bureau of Aeronautics directed Grumman to install the more powerful R-2800 engine in the Hellcat design. That decision transformed the aircraft from adequate to exceptional. The men who designed the Hellcat Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, based in Bethpage, Long Island, New York, produced the F6F Hellcat under the leadership of founder Leroy Grumman, who served as CEO and provided overall project oversight. The company had a reputation for building tough, reliable naval aircraft, and Navy pilots trusted Grumman products because they consistently brought pilots home even after taking damage that would destroy other aircraft. Leon Albert Swerble, known as Jake, served as general manager during the Hellcat's development and became famous for a particular act of resourcefulness. When wartime steel shortages threatened production, he secured metal from demolished New York City elevated railway structures, and that's the kind of problem-solving that kept production moving during wartime when conventional supply chains couldn't meet demand. William Schwendler, known as Bill, was chief engineer and advocated what became known as the Schwendler factor, which meant building components to twice their required strength. This philosophy made Grumman aircraft famously durable, and pilots joked that you could land a Grumman on a carrier deck hard enough to bend the deck, and the Grumman would be fine. That ruggedness saved countless lives when pilots brought damaged aircraft back to carriers after taking fire that would have brought down lighter-built fighters. Dick Hutton served as co-chief designer alongside Schwendler. These weren't household names like the generals and admirals who prosecuted the war, but their engineering decisions had direct battlefield impact, and every performance advantage, every armor plate, every self-sealing fuel tank represented choices these men made. From contract signing to combat deployment took just over 2 years. October 3, 1942, saw the first production F6F-3 take flight, and by January 4, 1943, VF-9 aboard USS Essex had received the first operational aircraft. 8 months later, those aircraft were in combat, and that development timeline was extraordinarily compressed even by wartime standards. Production eventually reached 644 aircraft per month, which meant one Hellcat rolling off the production line every hour around the clock. Total production reached between 12,272 and 12,275 aircraft, depending on which final inventory accounting you use, and either number represents an industrial achievement that Japan simply could not match. The battle that proved everything. Chanderi. June 19th and 20th, 1944, brought the Battle of the R. Philippine Sea, the F6F Hellcat's defining moment and the largest carrier battle in history. 24 aircraft carriers participated, and roughly 1,350 aircraft were engaged in what became known by its unofficial name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. June 19th alone saw over 350 Japanese aircraft shot down against approximately 30 American losses. In the second Japanese attack wave that day, 107 aircraft attacked the American fleet and 97 were destroyed, which works out to a 91% loss rate. A pilot aboard USS Lexington reportedly remarked, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." And the name stuck because it perfectly captured the one-sided nature of the engagement. The battle destroyed 90% of Japan's laboriously reconstituted carrier air groups. After Midway, after Guadalcanal, after all the attrition of 1942 and early 43, the Japanese Navy had painstakingly rebuilt its carrier aviation forces, and the Philippine Sea battle annihilated them in 2 days. Japanese carrier aviation as a credible fighting force ended right there. Within months, unable to compete conventionally, Japan turned to organized kamikaze tactics, and that decision represented an acknowledgement that Japanese pilots could no longer win air-to-air engagements against American fighters. Better to load the aircraft with explosives and guarantee at least some damage to enemy ships, even if it meant certain death for the pilot, than to send poorly trained aviators into air combat they were statistically certain to lose. The F6F Hellcat was the primary American fighter at the Philippine Sea battle. While other factors contributed to the victory, American radar-directed interception, superior pilot training, better damage control on American carriers, the Hellcat's performance advantage was fundamental. Japanese pilots flew into battle in Zeros that were slower, less durable, and less heavily armed than their opponents, and their lack of armor meant even minor hits could be fatal. Limited ammunition meant they couldn't sustain engagement, and inferior speed meant they couldn't escape once American fighters got on their tails. The Grumman F6F Hellcat's combat record produced statistics that seem almost too extraordinary to believe, which is exactly why we need to be careful about how we present them. Wartime aerial victory claims from all nations were typically inflated because pilots believed they'd scored kills that actually weren't kills. Multiple pilots would claim the same aircraft, and combat happened at high speed in 3 dimensions with limited visibility, where honest mistakes were common. With that caveat clearly stated, here are the official U.S. Navy figures for the F6F Hellcat's combat record. Between 5,156 and 5,223 aerial victories were credited to the aircraft, depending on which final accounting you reference, and Hellcats lost in aerial combat totaled approximately 270 aircraft. That produces an overall claimed kill ratio of 19-1. Specifically against the Zero, which was the F6F's primary opponent throughout most of the Pacific War, the claimed kill ratio was 13-1. Even accounting for likely overclaiming on the American side and some undercounting of American losses, these figures represent overwhelming air superiority by any measure. Between 305 and 307 U.S. Navy pilots became aces, meaning 5 or more victories, while flying the F6F Hellcat. Commander David McCampbell topped the list with 34 victories, all in the F6F, and his most famous engagement came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when he shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission while low on fuel and ammunition. Production statistics tell their own story about American industrial capacity versus Japanese. Total F6F production exceeded 12,000 aircraft, while Japan's total fighter production for the entire war, including all types from all manufacturers, was approximately 30,000 aircraft. Grumman alone produced 40% of what Japan's entire aviation industry produced across all fighter types throughout the war. And that single comparison explains more about the Pacific War's outcome than any individual battle narrative. Notable early Hellcat pilots. Beyond the commanders we've already mentioned, several pilots from the F6F's early combat period deserve recognition for their documented achievements. These aren't the most famous names from the Pacific War, but they were the men who proved the Hellcat's combat viability in those first months when the aircraft's reputation was still being established. Ensign Alex Vratiu scored his first victory at the Wake Island raid in October 1943 and would eventually achieve 19 confirmed victories, making him one of the Navy's top aces. His most famous engagement came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea when he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, and when he landed back on USS Lexington, he held up 6 fingers to the flight deck crew. That photograph became iconic. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loesch, who scored the very first F6F aerial victory against the Kawanishi flying boat on September 1, 1943, continued flying combat missions throughout the war. First blood matters in establishing a new weapon system's credibility, and Loesch provided that validation. Ensign Robert W. Duncan's achievement, scoring the first carrier-based Hellcat kills against Zeros on October 5, 1943, marked the moment when the F6F proved it could defeat Japan's premier fighter. Those 2 kills at Wake Island demonstrated the Hellcat wasn't just good against patrol aircraft and bombers, but could win fighter-versus-fighter engagements. Commander Jimmy Flatley led the first attack group from USS Yorktown during the Marcus Island raid. Flatley was already an experienced combat leader, and his endorsement of the Hellcat carried weight with other squadron commanders who would transition to the new aircraft in the months ahead. Tragically, Butch O'Hare, who had done so much to influence the Hellcat's development and commanded VF-6 during its combat debut, was killed in action on November 26, 1943, during a night intercept mission near the Gilbert Islands. 29 years old when he died, and Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was later named in his honor. The "climbing like Zeros" quote persists despite having no verifiable source and contradicting the technical evidence because it tells a story people want to hear. It captures the emotional reality of Japanese shock at encountering a superior American fighter after 2 years of air supremacy. It reduces a complex shift in the air war to a single, dramatic moment. It's memorable, and it sounds right. But sounds right isn't good enough for historical research. When you're producing a documentary or writing a history, you have a responsibility to verify claims before presenting them as fact. And that means checking primary sources, comparing multiple accounts, acknowledging when evidence is thin or contradictory, and admitting when you don't know something for certain. The Sueda anecdote I mentioned earlier, the Japanese ace who supposedly tried his climbing loop against a Hellcat and got shot down, might be true. It fits the time frame, it fits the tactical situation, it's plausible, but it appears only in secondary and tertiary sources without clear attribution to primary military records or first-hand accounts. That's why I presented it to you as plausible but unverified, rather than as established fact. That's the standard we should apply to all historical claims, especially dramatic ones. The more exciting a story sounds, the more carefully you should verify it, and the most sensational claims require the strongest evidence, not the weakest. The verified facts of the F6F Hellcat's combat introduction are compelling enough without embellishment. We know the dates, we know the places, we know the commanders, we know the squadrons, we know the performance data from official trials, we know the production figures, we know the approximate victory claims and their limitations, we know how Japanese pilot training collapsed, and we know how American industrial capacity and pilot training programs scaled up. That's a complete story. It explains how American naval aviation achieved air supremacy in the Pacific. It explains why the Battle of the Philippine Sea became a turkey shoot, and it explains why Japan turned to kamikaze tactics. The real history doesn't need fictional radio intercepts or unverifiable quotes to be fascinating. The F6F Hellcat never made Japanese pilots radio in shock that American fighters were climbing like Zeros because American fighters couldn't climb like Zeros at typical combat altitudes. The Zero actually had superior climb performance below 14,000 feet, but that technical reality didn't save Japanese pilots once they encountered Hellcats in combat. What the F6F offered wasn't any single overwhelming advantage, but comprehensive superiority across nearly every category that mattered: speed, diving performance, firepower, armor protection, high-altitude performance, and production availability. Add in superior American pilot training, radar-directed interception, effective damage control, and industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them, and you have the explanation for why Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed by mid-1944. August 31, 1943 at Marcus Island began the Hellcat's 22-month combat career that saw over 12,000 aircraft produced, more than 5,100 aerial victories claimed, and 300-plus Navy aces created. From Robert Duncan's first 0 kills at Wake Island in October 1943 to the final aerial victories of World War II, the F6F Hellcat dominated Pacific skies. But it did so through engineering, training, tactics, and industrial capacity, not through mythical climb rates that impressed Japanese pilots. The real story is one of methodical American problem-solving, where combat reports identified what pilots needed, engineers designed it, factories built it in overwhelming numbers, and training programs produced pilots who could use it effectively. The result was decisive. When you encounter dramatic historical claims, especially quotes that sound perfect, victories that seem too one-sided, or moments that feel too cinematically perfect, approach them with healthy skepticism. Check the sources, verify the numbers, look for primary documentation, and be willing to say, "We don't know," when the evidence isn't there. The history of the Second World War is dramatic enough, tragic enough, and important enough that it doesn't need embellishment. The men who flew these missions, designed these aircraft, and gave their lives in this conflict deserve to have their stories told accurately, and that's the responsibility every historian, documentarian, and researcher carries. The F6F Hellcat achieved air superiority through superior performance, superior training, and superior numbers. That's not as catchy as a radio intercept quote, but it's what actually happened, and what actually happened is always more valuable than what makes a good story. Thank you for watching.